With regard to the political disturbances in 1989, had the Chinese government not taken the resolute measures, then we could not have enjoyed the stability that we are enjoying today.
China entered the 1990s in a state of political deep freeze. After the army's crackdown in Tiananmen Square in June 1989, Communist Party hardliners tightened their control, imposing a stifling ideological orthodoxy, accelerating a purge against liberal figures associated with the '89 protests. For American and other foreign correspondents in Beijing, the heady days of the late 1980s were replaced by an atmosphere of fear.
It felt like the invasion of the body snatchers had happened. I mean, it was just like this was a different country. Nobody would talk to you. Everybody was terrified. It was just the most shocking and depressing thing, I've ever seen in my life.
I mean, I'm usually a fairly mellow guy and be driving along, and these state security goons would be tailing me, and I would go around a corner and I would catch myself just wishing that those guys would slide out of control and go under a bus.
Nicholas Kristof's wife, Cheryl Wu Dun, also a Times reporter, had just had a baby. The Chinese refused to give him a visa.
It just came back no. And, we're supposed to get the proper visa because he was going to be part of our family. We needed to have a residence permit, and they just wouldn't give it.
For some reporters, it became too much.
After Tiananmen, it was just such a kind of dark, restricted environment that we just really didn't want to stay longer than we had to.
By 1990, Ignatius and his wife, Elliot, were among a growing number of bitter and disillusioned Tiananmen veterans leaving China for other assignments. Lena Sun, a Chinese-American who had studied in Beijing in the late 1970s, replaced Daniel Sutherland at the Washington Post.
Arriving after Tiananmen I think it was one of the most difficult periods especially for American journalists. People didn't want to talk to you, understandably. American journalists were singled out for more scrutiny.
Jim McGregor, who'd been based in Taiwan, took over the Wall Street Journal bureau from Adi Ignatius in mid-1990.
So I arrive in China, and it's post-Tiananmen, and it's very depressing. All the correspondents talked about was Tiananmen. Every dinner you went to, that's all they would. Where were you? What did you see? People were very bitter.
And it unquestionably affected the coverage. Jaime Floracruz, a Filipino who'd been in China since 1971, was working for Time magazine.
It did dominate our reporting on China-U.S. relations, on China's relations with the outside world.
State Department official Stapleton Roy, who'd been born in China of missionary parents in the 1940s, would soon become the U.S. ambassador in Beijing.
You couldn't have a story on China on U.S. television without a picture of the student standing in front of the tank. That means that every time you touched on China, you had a pejorative image of China as part of the story.
Hoping to blunt some of the negative publicity, in May of 1990, China's new Communist Party chief, Jiang Zemin, agreed to speak with Barbara Walters of ABC News. It was the first interview any senior Chinese leader had given since the crackdown.
In the middle of the interview, I produced a photograph which I had been sitting on. And it was a photograph of the young man, unknown, who had put his hand up and stopped the tanks. We did not know what had happened to him, whether he was still alive, and I asked this of Jiang Zemin. Do you have any idea what happened to this young man?
I think this young man will be not killed by the tank.
No, but did you arrest him? We heard he was arrested and executed.
Well, I can't confirm whether this young man you mentioned was arrested or not.
You do not know what happened to him?
But I think never killed.
You think he was never killed?
I think never killed.
Never killed.
As the first anniversary of the crackdown approached, tension in Beijing increased. The authorities were really determined to prevent any commemoration of what had happened the year before. So the police were out in force. I remember reporters and crews who tried to do anything from Tiananmen Square itself were hassled, roughed up, some were detained. That night, many of us gathered outside the gates of Beijing University. We could hear the students chanting and singing, but we couldn't get in, and the police there too were very rough and chased us all away. During the Tiananmen protests, the New York Times' Nick Kristof and Sheryl Wu Dunn had become friendly with a Tsinghua University student named Liu Xiang. Arrested after the crackdown, he had managed to escape, and in June 1990 returned to Beijing to ask the couple for help in fleeing the country.
We didn't know what to do. We, by and large, trusted Liu Xiang, but he also acknowledged that he'd been in prison, and you could easily imagine a deal whereby he would be released from prison if he would entrap us. And so we were very torn about our ethical obligations there. Finally, Sheryl just said, you know, look, he helped us, he helped our readers. If we don't help him, he's going to go. We've got to do something. And so we very carefully gave him, we helped him in ways that were as deniable, in places that we were sure we weren't being filmed, and he was able to escape, and he got to Hong Kong.
Stifled in so much of her reporting, the Washington Post's Lena Sun was able to resume a friendship she'd made as a student in China in the late 70s with a young man named Bai Weiji, who'd become a foreign ministry official.
He would give me internal analyses of what was going on. Not secret, but you know, a lot of the Nebu documents are not secret, they're just more frank and candid. And she would translate them, and it was very useful.
In May 1992, police raided Sun's office in the so-called diplomatic compounds where foreign reporters were required to live, searched through her notes, and found some of the material Bai had given her.
In the end, my friend was charged with treason, and he was sentenced to 10 years in jail. His wife was sentenced to 6 years in jail.
The night we heard about what happened to her, the people, the Chinese, her sources, Nick and I just couldn't sleep.
We just stayed up tossing and turning all night and thinking, you know, that could have been our friends. And you know, being really shaken by that and really feeling that we wanted out, because at some point our luck was going to run out and our friends were going to go to prison.
That June was the 3rd anniversary of the Tiananmen crackdown. At ABC News, producer Chito Ramana sent correspondent Todd Carroll to the square to check out a tip that a lone protester was planning to unfurl a banner.
The guy unfurled the banner, and Todd tried to film it. But there were all these plainclothesmen who saw him and tried to get the camera away from him. No, he resisted. Todd resisted.
Plainclothes policemen from all over the square descended on us and the man and began beating us and grabbing him. And
Carroll managed to produce a story that night.
And did the authorities have any hesitation about beating up on you as well as on the lone demonstrator?
Absolutely not, but these authorities were plainclothesmen. We were later beat by people in uniform, but they're all the same, part of the big security apparatus in a police state.
But something was clearly wrong.
He still couldn't walk, you know, he couldn't work long hours. He couldn't work regular hours. And he would go back and rest again, and then finally he talked to New York and they said, go back to the States, we'll have it examined.
The police beating left Carroll with permanent damage. He was forced to leave China and give up journalism. The ongoing repression and the still powerful images from 1989 continued to make the human rights story the dominant narrative in U.S. media coverage of China, and with the presidential election in 1992 in the American political debate about China as well. James Baker was President Bush's Secretary of State.
I remember when we were running for re-election in 1992, against Clinton, and he accused us, of course, of coddling dictators, which was, I guess, a good political stratagem in the United States.
Not coddled tyrants from Baghdad to Beijing.
Kenneth Lieberthal served as Clinton's top Asia expert in the president's second term.
In the first few years, he did try to connect specific progress in human rights issues in China to the annual renewal of what was called Most Favored Nation trade status.
Without MFN, Chinese exports would be effectively frozen out of the U.S. market. Clinton's tough approach, not surprisingly, led to a sharp increase in tension with China.
The Chinese were determined to convey to the Clinton administration that if you seek to leverage how we govern our people for favors in terms of American policy, forget about it.
Mr. Clinton has threatened to revoke China's trade privileges unless it shows significant progress on human rights.
The battle over MFN became a staple for the American press corps.
Renewal of Most Favored Nation status, I must have written 3,000 stories about that. Because each time it came up, it was a real issue.
Looking back on it, I think the focus we had on MFN and human rights kind of blinded us to another really important part of the China story, and that was that the market reforms were still going on. I remember in late 91 and in 92, I kept hearing, especially from foreign businessmen, that there were really interesting things going on in southern China and that there was more to the China story than just repression. In February 1992, Deng Xiaoping visited the Shenzhen and Zhuhai special economic zones in southern China, as well as Shanghai. Deng had watched the Soviet Union collapse the previous year, and unlike hardliners who felt China would meet the same fate if it didn't abandon market reforms, Deng reached the opposite conclusion, that only accelerated economic restructuring could help the Communist Party stay in power. What became known as the Nanxun, or Southern Tour, broke the political deadlock and sparked a new wave of entrepreneurial energy. Orville Schell, who'd first visited China in the 70s, was writing about the country for The New Yorker.
That was a monumental moment as monumental in a way as when Deng Xiaoping came to America in 1979. Deng Xiaoping was on the march again. And that when he went, of course, to Shenzhen in 1992, he was back going to ram home a new program of economic reform.
What was going on was this economic dynamism. It was a dynamo. This is the beginning of the economic revolution.
Beginning in '93, China's economy started taking off. The American business community noticed this immediately, and they began to flock into China. Every American during 1993 who visited China was shocked to discover that the circumstances in China were so much better than was being reported in the American media.
Slowly, American journalists began to shift their focus away from human rights and towards a country consumed by a gold rush.
The name of the game here is investment, efficiency, entrepreneurship, and profits.
Every time you'd go out to an economic zone or meet a mayor or even a governor or party secretary, who were all pretty accessible in those days, you would sit down and they'd all tell you the same things. And then they'd say, okay, now you're from the Wall Street Journal, we need foreign investment. How do we get more foreign investment? How can you help us? Let us show you what we have everywhere.
You could sort of see it bubble up in this desire, this rush to embrace materialism.
Joseph Kahn was reporting for the Dallas Morning News.
In those days when you were a foreigner, when you were a reporter, and you went out and you talked to people in a factory or even in a village, you got more questions often than you were able to ask. People wanted to know how you did it, how much you made, what's the path to becoming a journalist? They wanted to compare all these basics. People were just looking to get ahead, and you could just sense the energy in the place.
Andrew Brown of Reuters set up the first Western news bureau in Shanghai, which soon became the epicenter of the emerging boom.
Shanghai had really been electrified by Deng Xiaoping's trip.
The city itself was changing visibly. The topography of the city was transformed. We were all there for the same reason. The economy was taking off. This was now China's market economy.
Marcus Brauchley was in charge of the Wall Street Journal's China coverage.
The Journal covered China a lot more aggressively and a lot more closely than our big newspaper rivals did through most of the 1990s, because we saw it as a central story for our core readership, which is business. We had opened the first American news bureau in Shanghai in 93 or 94 with Joe Kahn. We hired Joe from the Dallas News. And then I decided to become the bureau chief, and then when I moved to Shanghai, I decided to move the bureau chief's job to Shanghai instead of Beijing to signal that we were about covering the socioeconomic changes in China, not the pronouncements of various government ministries in Beijing.
I was sent to Shanghai, which at that point had only recently been opened up to foreign journalists and was viewed by the leadership as a bigger experiment than the southern China, Shenzhen, Guangzhou openness to foreign investment had been. They were now willing to experiment with economic reform with a much larger, and for the party, a much more vital center of industry and commerce. So that was, my initial foray there was partly about the revival of spirit of economic reform.
From a news perspective, it meant that we had to suddenly take teams of reporters that we had who were pretty much geared to the political, social story and repurpose them for covering markets. And such a creature didn't exist. There weren't reporters at the time who understood, and I didn't myself, how do you cover a futures market? And there were 24 futures markets suddenly set up all over China. Plywood futures in Suzhou, mung bean futures in Dalian, grains futures in Zhengzhou. And these were big markets, foreign exchange markets in Shanghai.
The big excitement at that time was around the creation of the domestic stock markets. There was a culture of investment that was growing up around the stock market. Not all of it very healthy, much of it just sort of pure speculation.
The first business story I wrote in China was about a guy named Millions Yang in Shanghai who had cornered I think there was 4 or 6 stocks on this illegal market, and then one thing led to another, and the markets just exploded.
At the time, there were all these millionaires in the making. Some of them were local in Beijing, and I was writing about them. And in that in that wave, that was really new. You just couldn't believe that they were doing that.
Kathy Chen, a Chinese American, was assigned to the Journal's Beijing bureau. She soon started hanging out at a riding stable run by a former senior military officer, which catered to China's new rich.
A lot of the kids of the military leaders used to go there, and they bought their own horses, and it was just the beginning of the Chinese who were getting very wealthy off of these business opportunities that were opened up by Deng Xiaoping's Southern Tour, and they were feeling that they wanted to really live, and so they bought horses, they bought dogs, they went horseback riding.
The people she met there soon became valuable sources.
Those were kind of sources that turned out to be really helpful, because they were people that you met outside of the official channels who heard rumors, who knew things.
Chen found that being Chinese American was a huge journalistic asset.
It also allowed me to kind of melt into the crowd at times, which was very helpful, because back in the early 90s, the state security police were still all over the place.
The New York Times' Cheryl Wudun had the same experience.
It was much easier for me to operate in China because, Nick just stood out so plainly, and whereas I really could blend in, and so people would often prefer to meet with me than with him.
But looking local had its drawbacks, as Wudun discovered at a party attended by the Minister of Construction.
Some of the, his representatives came over to me and said, "Oh yes, the minister would like to have a dance with you." And I said, "Oh, sure." And so I went up and had a dance, and then he would really start doing a lot more than just dancing. And so I kept pushing back, and then I said, God, he's really being aggressive. And then, so basically I said, I know what I'll do. I'll tell him I'm from the New York Times. And that just like, that really did startle him. And I think that he thought that I was a secretary and that I was one of the secretaries there.
Wu Dun, the Washington Post, Lena Sun, and some other women foreign correspondents formed an informal club.
Turned out there were all these women who are ethnic Chinese working as journalists in China. And we decided that we would have this group, and it was called MSG, Macho Sino Girls, We Give You a Headache.
Wen Chun Fan was another Chinese-American joining a rapidly changing U.S. press corps. Educated at Beijing University, he joined CNN as a cameraman.
I think it was really helpful in terms of just being able to blend in, and people wouldn't automatically associate you with being a foreign journalist. I spoke Chinese without an accent, so it would be fine, and I could, people would think I was a local, so it was an advantage.
To the surprise of many reporters, Jiang Zemin, who'd replaced the liberal Zhao Ziyang during the 1989 crisis, emerged as a strong supporter of Deng's reforms. He was assisted by Zhu Rongji, the charismatic, blunt-talking former mayor of Shanghai.
Zhu Rongji was respected in the Shanghai context as someone who got things done, who understood economics in that kind of 1990 style sort of communist way of being, very hands-on and problem solving as sort of an economic model. There was a strike. He figured out a way to diffuse the strike. There was a crisis between a foreign investor and a Chinese joint venture partner. He sat them down and talked them through it and came out with a solution. That was Zhu Rongji's reputation. So as he started to rise up in the central government, I think that was somewhat coincident with the sort of rising expectations that maybe that reform was real this time around.
One of the key reforms Zhu spearheaded was the restructuring of China's inefficient, money-losing, state-owned enterprises. Ian Johnson had come to Beijing for the Baltimore Sun in 1994 and later joined the Wall Street Journal.
Zhu was the most arrogant SOB you've ever met. He was also one of the most brilliant SOBs you've ever met. And of course the problem was he knew it, and that's why he was so arrogant and insufferable. And you can only imagine what it would be like if you were some state-owned enterprise flunky who was losing money or doing something terrible. Zhu would just give you a tongue lashing. The stories of how he pushed through reforms are legendary.
Charles Hutzler joined the AP's Beijing bureau in 1995.
And so it was a period of shock and pain, especially in urban China, where you had state-run factories just laying off, in many cases, almost all of their workforce. And if you went to towns in the Northeast or places like Taiyuan, real centers of the state-run economy of heavy industry, these were communities that were in great pain.
But the restructuring helped invigorate a long moribund economy. And with increased growth, reporters found Chinese companies increasingly receptive to coverage.
The smart Chinese companies were more than willing to have foreign reporters come and talk to them. And this was happening throughout society.
It was a sharp contrast to the continuing silence of many U.S. companies who, given the negative attitudes about China in the United States, feared drawing attention to their expanded operations in the People's Republic.
Corporate America is a lot like the Communist Party. They don't like journalists. They don't want to talk to them. They want everything controlled.
One of the big stories in the mid-90s was the movement of people from the countryside to the coastal areas, where the number of foreign-funded factories was dramatically increasing.
At that time, I think there were about 100 million migrant workers. These were farmers, peasants, mostly young people who would flock from the countryside where there wasn't very much to do, to the cities in southern China and along the coast. and find factory work. And so we wanted to do a story about that.
She went to Sichuan and found a village and found some young women who were going to make the journey from this village by bus, whatever, 24, 36 hours by bus down winding roads with little to eat, to a factory job in Dongguan, a place they'd never been, knew nothing about, where people spoke a different kind of Chinese.
For these girls, though, it was both exciting and a little scary and extremely uncomfortable at the beginning because, you know, so many of them were car sick. And so they would all be throwing up outside of the windows and, you know, there was no shower and, you know, you went to the bathroom whenever they stopped and, you know, brush your teeth if you were lucky. And it was 5 days of this. And by the end of it, the whole place smelled like vomit and sweat. It was really disgusting.
The girls ended up in a factory making toys for the American market.
I was able to sneak in later because I looked Chinese. And so, you know, I dressed in jeans and tried to look like the rest of them. And so I was able to see the conditions of the dorms and talk to them and follow up on what they were doing, which was stitching hair into the scalps of Barbie doll heads. So for a couple $100 a month or something.
She wrote an incredibly poignant and powerful story about what this internal migration is like, the human side of this emerging economic powerhouse. So that's a story that I think really began to shape the world's understanding of how China really worked.
Chun's ability to make that trip was one sign of how the economic liberalization was beginning to lead to better working conditions for foreign reporters.
The fact that the society itself had started to change, the people were more free to talk and more confident to talk with the journalists, I think made a big difference.
By the mid-1990s, it had become easy to travel around, and especially to go to other cities and not stand out, so that you could actually go and do reporting for a few days in a major city without having the police necessarily come and track you down.
It was still necessary to get permission from the local Foreign Affairs office, but the hunger for money made that easier too.
They were motivated by money because the Foreign Affairs offices began to charge a day rate for their people, which is kind of pretty fresh when you think of it. You know, you're paying somebody to mind you, but they'd say they were a guide. They'd pay for a car and a driver. And they'd also put you up in the local hotel, and I guess they had some relation with the hotel and were probably making some kickback on the side off this. So they were kind of eager, depending on their entrepreneurial spirit, for you to come out there.
From his base in Hong Kong, Keith Richburg was traveling regularly to Beijing for the Washington Post.
Where, you know, the tanks once rolled, I was seeing signs for Hennessy cognac, and I was seeing signs for luxury goods popping up. And I was thinking to myself, this is some amazing transformation that's going on in China right now. Beijing was kind of really exploding as it went from being this kind of difficult place for correspondents to live to being actually kind of fun.
The reporters began to cover a new post-Tiananmen youth culture. They found many urban young people, like punk rocker He Young, disillusioned both by politics and by the greed and materialism now surrounding them. "We live in a garbage dump," He Young sang in his biggest hit, "We swallow our consciences and excrete ideology."
There were all these things going on in society that were absolutely fascinating. There were a lot more, clubs and places to go eat and places to party. I covered the story of the first big American-style mega disco that opened in Beijing called Nightman. I covered all kinds of stories about the first computer matchmaking service for Chinese.
Shanghai was a fun place to live. Shanghai was a place where there weren't the controls you had in Beijing. It was a place where the energy was just, pounding. You could feel everybody. You had 30 million people on the make. I used to say that, China's not a free market economy. China's a free-for-all economy. Everybody was trying to do something in Shanghai in those days.
Broccoli was so caught up in the go-go atmosphere that he organized an annual ball at Shanghai's legendary Peace Hotel, which had been the center of expat life before the Communist Revolution.
My wife was in Hong Kong, I was in Shanghai, so we had what we called the Commuters' Ball. I organized every October. In Chinese, we call it the Waidiran Wanhui, the Migrant Workers' Evening Party. And we'd invite several hundred people to come, and usually in an old colonial-style building. And we'd have a jazz band, and it would be a good party.
It was a big party time in Shanghai, the Commuters' Bowl and the Peace Hotel. It wasn't just a party for China, this was regional party. People flew in from everywhere. Shanghai was the aspirational place. You wanted to be there. That's where things were happening. That's where the future of China was China was reinventing itself.
I call that the golden age of covering China. It really was.
In Beijing, Kathy Chen followed in the steps of the rich Chinese she'd met at the riding stable by adopting a puppy she'd seen there.
There were these big black dogs, a pair of them that the stable owned, and they had like a dozen puppies. I decided that I wanted one. And so within a year, she grew up into this huge dog. But unfortunately, the government decided enough was enough with all these people owning dogs. They issued an edict banning big dogs from the city center.
The only exception was for foreign diplomats. That saved Agatha when, on a walk one day, she escaped and was grabbed by the police, who tied her up at the police station.
I took her collar and took it off of her, and we ran. And we just ran, and this was in the diplomatic area, so there were a lot of embassies, right? And so I was like, we've got to find some shelter. And so the first embassy that I saw with its gates open was the Irish embassy. And so I ran up to the guard and I was like, I've got to get inside with my dog. And so actually a diplomat came out, and he was really nice. He's like, and I explained to him what happened, and he's like, okay, well, come in. And he brought me in the embassy with my dog, with Agatha. And he closed the doors and he said, just wait here, we can hang out here for a while. And so I was there for like an hour, and then he's like, okay, come on, I'll take you back. And so he put me in his car, which had embassy plates on it, so diplomatic plates. And then he drove me back to the compound, to where we lived. So she was able to get away.
As China continued to open up, however, a cloud was hovering over the country. Deng Xiaoping was in his 90s and visibly failing. The People's Republic had a history of tumultuous leadership transitions. When Chairman Mao died, his widow Jiang Qing, who sought to seize power, was purged and eventually put on trial. During the Tiananmen Square crisis, Deng Xiaoping's designated heir Zhao Ziyang was ousted and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. So, for the Foreign Press Corps, the Deng Xiaoping Death Watch became an all-consuming obsession.
We never could leave the office unstaffed, and you know, this was before the day of supremely portable communications, and so we were constantly on death watch.
Every time I went on vacation, I had to update the obit.
It was a constant preoccupation for reporters. You know, after Deng, what will happen? Will there be chaos?
And we're all sure that when Deng dies, you know, there are all these scenarios. There might be civil war, there might be this, there might be that. That Jiang Zemin only was there through the grace of Deng Xiaoping when he left, and there were going to be other people who were going to take over or push Jiang out of the way.
On the night of February 19th, 1997, Deng Xiaoping died. Rebecca McKinnon, a fluent Chinese speaker who'd lived in Beijing as a child, had returned to the country for CNN.
While I was eating dinner, I got a call from a Chinese friend saying, it looks like he might have really died. And so, of course, I rushed back to the bureau and started, putting together notes and, watching the wires and watching Xinhua. We needed a bit more confirmation than that because false rumors of Deng's death, had caught many a journalist in the past. So Mei Yan, who was working as an assignment editor on the international desk, who was from China, who had high-ranking connections in China, both through her family and professionally, managed to confirm it through somebody, a relative of somebody high-ranking in the Chinese elite. And so we decided to go with it. And it wasn't very long after that Xinhua started coming out.
The formal transition to Jiang Zemin, however, proved surprisingly anticlimactic.
This was a great sign of sort of the degrees to which China had become a more normal society, that for most people there may have been a twinge of sort of sadness, but mostly they were just interested in getting on with their lives.
It was an anticlimax because the expected kind of political crisis or protest out in the streets or factional divide spilling over into the streets of China didn't happen.
As they covered the reaction to Deng's death, the reporters also found that for many Chinese, his role in changing the country far outweighed his responsibility for Tiananmen Square.
I found there was real affection for Deng. Not that many people really mentioned Tiananmen Square. They mentioned how, the fact that this place was booming.
In the wake of Deng's passing, there were some significant changes in the American press corps, including the return of John Pomfret, who, as an AP correspondent, had been expelled from China in the wake of the Tiananmen crackdown and had spent the years since covering the war in Bosnia for the Washington Post. But to get a visa, Pomfret had to write something Beijing could interpret as an apology.
I wrote a self-criticism, but writing it so that one day if it was published on the front page of the People's Daily, I wouldn't be embarrassed, right? But I knew that I had to express a personal sense of maturation, if you will, or understanding, which I did. And it was relatively easy because I said, look, I was in Bosnia for 4 years, and I understand what chaos is, and I wouldn't want chaos visited on any country, China being one of them.
After several years away, mostly in war zones, Pomfret was amazed by what he found in China.
I appreciated very deeply the fact that Chinese wanted to build roads, they didn't want to mine them. And that helped, I think, to add a certain level of understanding in writing about this place. And when I came back, I was sort of that energy of the South had moved up to the North, basically. The whole country had been caffeinated, if you will. And so there was this sense of like, the whole China now is go-go China.
Melinda Liu, who'd opened the Newsweek bureau in 1980, also returned for a second assignment and had a similar reaction.
Just like a whole new world. There are physical things that might seem familiar, but then if you dig underneath them, it's like totally not what you thought it would be. In the sense that China was moving out of not only its own past, even long past, feudal past, Tiananmen past, Maoist past. Some of that was all going away, and it had begun to embrace the future. The new stuff, the internet, market economy, all these things.
Elizabeth Rosenthal, who just arrived for the New York Times, was equally impressed.
Suddenly, we met Chinese who were buying their first cars or buying their first flats, and it was still at that time very hard for Chinese to get passports to go overseas. They were going on their first vacations, they were taking these road trips. So from a social perspective, it was a pretty extraordinary time to watch this society open up.
The Chinese media, long tightly controlled, reflected this greater openness.
They started to kind of be more robust and, to a certain extent, more free to write, not about sensitive topics, but beyond those topics, they started to write various stories in a more interesting and real way.
For the first time, the internet was also emerging as a powerful force in China.
The internet was not as constrained, not nearly as constrained as it is now. There were people seeking freedom and seeking their identity online.
Despite the relaxation, the Chinese press still faced significant restrictions. The correspondents found that frustrated Chinese journalists themselves often became important sources.
I had friends who worked in the Chinese media, and in the 90s, I don't know what the relationship is now, but there was certainly kind of a relationship by which there were some types of things that your Chinese friends knew they would never kind of get published or aired in the Chinese media, but they wanted it to get out.
On July 1st, 1997, Britain handed its longtime colony Hong Kong back to China. For the Chinese leadership, regaining sovereignty was a moment of supreme importance. Beijing promised that Hong Kong could retain its freewheeling way of life under a formula called One Country, Two Systems. For the American and international press corps, it was a major story.
I was there for the handover. That was why the Washington Post decided to open a bureau in Hong Kong just to be there for the handover.
I'd finally left Beijing and moved to Hong Kong. The idea was that the handover was going to be this really huge story. In fact, CNN sent dozens of extra people to cover the event. There were anchors and correspondents and camera crews. But after the drama of that night, it was like life just went on as normal, and the handover became a kind of non-event, which was quickly overshadowed by other news.
The moment did, however, become a symbol of how China's leadership was emerging from the shadows of 1989. A further step in that direction came in October, when Jiang Zemin paid a state visit to the U.S., which Bill Clinton reciprocated by visiting Beijing in June 1998. Clinton had dropped his efforts to link MFN renewal to China's human rights record, and both summits were designed to put Sino-American relations on a more even keel. But the legacy of Tiananmen continued to shape the relationship, leading to a remarkable televised exchange between the two leaders in Beijing.
We still disagree about the meaning of what happened then. I believe, and the American people believe, that the use of force and the tragic loss of life was wrong.
With regard to the political disturbances in 1989, had the Chinese government not taken the resolute measures, then we could not have enjoyed the stability that we are enjoying today.
With the arrival of 1999, the 10th anniversary of the Tiananmen crackdown was approaching. It would turn out to be a tumultuous end to the decade. At CNN, Rebecca McKinnon began to prepare a 10th anniversary documentary, working with Chinese-American cameraman Wenchun Fan. They decided to try and interview Bao Tung, who'd been secretary to Zhao Ziyang in 1989 and had then been jailed for 8 years and was now under house arrest.
Wenchun dismantled the camera, put it in a crappy gym bag. I wore a crappy Chinese coat with a hood. We got a plastic bag of Chinese medicine and a fruit basket, and parked the car quite far away from Bao Tung's complex and walked over to the complex, managed to walk right into his apartment, went right up to his apartment, knocked on the door. He opens it. We're like, "Hi, we're CNN." And he's like, "Oh, great. Wait in there. I'll be right there." Wenchun reassembled the camera, took a tape out of his back vest in his pocket, and we proceeded to do the interview, in which Mr. Bao was extremely scathing about the current generation of leaders who he called the successors of Deng Xiaoping's mistakes, and he placed the blame squarely on Deng. It was quite an interview.
We pretty much knew that we would be intercepted by the security guards when we left the apartment. So we gave the tape that had the interview on it to Mr. Bao, and we would arrange to pick it up some other time in some other place. But we figured the security people knew what they were doing, so they'd ask to see the tape, and it would look dumb if we showed up with a camera with a blank tape inside.
And we proceeded to record an exchange in which I pleaded with him to grant an interview, and he continued to politely and steadfastly refuse.
We walked out of the apartment with that tape in the camera, and sure enough, the security guards stopped us. We were taken to a room. They asked us a lot of questions. They asked us to see the video in the camera. We played it back to them, and there was Mr. Bao saying, "I don't want to be interviewed." So that was our story.
Then, of course, the interview aired on June 4th. I had an opportunity to meet Bao Tung's son a couple months later, And Bao Pu told me that several of the officers we had met that night at the police station were fired because of this. The foreign ministry was very upset. They were basically making noises that they knew my visa was coming up soon and that, you know, they may or may not feel like renewing it, kind of, and that we lied to the police. Yeah, no, it caused great consternation.
In the meantime, Zhu Rongji, who'd become premier, was struggling to conclude negotiations with the U.S. on China's entry to the World Trade Organization, a key move to accelerate the process of economic reform. In early April 1999, Zhu flew to the United States.
A major objective of that visit was to reach final agreement, nail down the final few terms on the bilateral accession agreement terms. This would have been, for a variety of reasons, a huge step in U.S.-China relations and a huge step in China joining the WTO.
They didn't let us travel on the plane with him, but we could travel in parallel with the Chinese delegation, and then they arranged for us to be on their motorcades, sort of like, you know, American journalists are with the American president, which was fascinating because that suggested a degree of sophistication hitherto unseen in Beijing. And so we came, and he went to Washington. He saw President Clinton, and for whatever reason, the White House wasn't ready to deal on WTO.
He didn't want to sign a deal that the Congress would not support, and there was still a little work to do on that. Zhu felt humiliated.
The tension created by Zhu's unsuccessful visit was fueled by U.S.-led NATO airstrikes on Yugoslavia that spring, military action which China opposed. Shortly after Zhu returned to Beijing, with the differences over China's WTO membership still unresolved, Sino-American relations took a dramatic turn for the worse.
The phone rang, and it was a Situation Room at the White House saying, Mr. Lieberthal, yes, we are watching CNN. And Xi reported on CNN that U.S. planes have just bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. The Chinese have been extremely critical of our bombing campaign in Yugoslavia. And so they immediately felt that the bombing of their embassy in Belgrade was a specific targeted move by the United States to both reduce their capabilities in Belgrade and to punish them, to humiliate them by bombing their sovereign territory, which an embassy is, without warning and, as it turns out, killing some embassy staff.
The bombing had, in fact, been a targeting error.
The bombs were intended to be dropped on a building a block away. But there was a targeting error made in the initial targeting package that was developed, frankly, by someone who had never done a targeting package before and made a cardinal error in the way he identified the specific target to be bombed.
The reaction in Beijing, however, was immediate and furious.
Suddenly the U.S. became, public enemy number one, and, to do reporting, you have to go into the crowds outside the embassy, which were a mix of, as all kind of sanctioned demonstrations are, a mix of genuine upset and, government inflamed anger. So there were a lot of hotheads in the crowd. There were things being thrown.
I was standing to the side to do a phone report with Atlanta live on air. And so I'm standing there, and they put me on air, have me give an update from the scene. I'm describing what's going on. The protesters are trying to light the flag on fire, and they're throwing bottles and shouting epithets. And some people near me start shouting, and I said, and they're shouting at me too because they think I'm American. And the anchor says, "Oh, what are they shouting?" And I'm like, "Well, I can't repeat it on air." And they said, "Well, what else are they doing?" And it's like, "Well, this gentleman here is saying something quite obscene. Whoops, he hit me. I have to go." And at which point, the man who had hit me and a few other people near him were yelling, "Da ta, sha ta," hit her, kill her. Fortunately, there were some student-type people who kind of pulled me away.
The embassy protests added to a sense of tension in Beijing that had been heightened just a few days earlier, when thousands of members of the Falun Gong spiritual group had suddenly materialized outside Zhongnan High, the compound in the center of the city where the Chinese leadership lives and works, demanding official government recognition.
I remember walking up to them, group by group. I introduced myself as somebody who worked for Time magazine and in Chinese, and I asked them, "Can you tell me what's going on? Why are you here?" None of them would talk. Zip. Zero, no soundbite, no nothing.
It was just bizarre. It was so bizarre, it was shocking, that there are all these kind of middle-aged, ordinary-looking people who were clearly not sophisticated Beijingers, but from elsewhere. We're all just sitting there, meditating near the complex. And many of them didn't want to be interviewed.
Craig Smith, now in Shanghai for the Wall Street Journal, had already been looking into the group.
They were crazy. There were people banging themselves against trees, and there was people walking backwards. That was a big one. There was a group that would shout this magic number. They would, at the top of their lungs, over and over again. So I set out to do a story on cults, on the rise of cults in China.
Smith managed to secure an interview with the spiritual leader of the Falun Gong, Li Hongzhi, who lived in New Jersey.
I thought we kind of established a rapport. I said, where you lose me is when you start saying things like you can fly. And so why do you have to do that? You have a very credible and valuable moral system here that you're teaching. Why do you have to talk about things like flying? And he got really agitated and leaned forward and said, I can fly. There are a lot of people that can fly. There are people in America who can fly.
Nonetheless, the popular appeal of the Falun Gong was one sign of a search for moral values at a time of bewildering change. For China's leaders, however, the fact that an unauthorized demonstration by thousands of people had been planned right under the noses of the security apparatus was unnerving.
They do the protest in front of Zhongnan High. Jiang Zemin gets, a bug up his ass about the whole thing, decides they have to crush it.
Covering the crackdown on what the Chinese government called the evil Falun Gong cult became a staple of the China Beat, to the discomfort of many correspondents.
I think the kind of Chinese Communist Party versus the Falun Gong, in the international media, it was portrayed, the storyline was, the innocent religious activists versus the thugs. Unfortunately, what it felt like covering the story, it was the Fruit Loops versus the thugs. I mean, you just felt icky about the whole story.
But the push for economic reform continued, with Zhu Rongji finally reaching a deal with the U.S. for China to enter the World Trade Organization.
It was a massive game changer. It meant everything. Suddenly they had real competition inside China, and this was Zhu Rongji's game plan all along: bring in foreign players, introduce competition, and strengthen our domestic champions.
In the fall of 1999, Beijing marked the 50th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic with the biggest parade in Tiananmen Square in years. It was a chance for China's leaders to trumpet their successes after a turbulent decade. Even normally cynical reporters acknowledged how dramatically things had changed.
I think people underestimated, frankly, the nimbleness and the flexibility of the Communist Party.
There is also with China a huge amount of very positive change that gets overlooked in the kind of snapshot analysis that gets done about China, which is nominally a communist country.
But for the Foreign Press Corps, the dizzying changes meant only a modification, not an end to the intimidation, pressure, and surveillance they faced trying to cover the country. As the year and the decade drew to an end, the Beijing Foreign Correspondents Club produced a gag video for its annual Christmas party to take some of the sting out of living and working in China. It featured Norman Batorf of the AP.
Norman, how about a piece of gum? Sure.
Driven mad by the city's pervasive cockroaches. Venturing into the filthy basement of the so-called diplomatic compounds where foreign reporters were required to live. There, he discovers a Chinese police team led by CNN's Wen Chunfan, in full police uniform, spying on a Western reporter in her bathrobe.
ABC News, Beijing.
My God, they really are bugging us.
And then he encounters an evil cult devoted to the worship of Time magazine's Jaime Floracruz.
Turn the wheel of Jimmy. Sense the Jimmy waves.
Theater of the absurd, but an accurate reflection of how many foreign correspondents felt about their fascinating and maddening beat.
Crawl like Jimmy. A nest of evil roaches. You all must die! Poison's too good for you! The mother of all cockroaches, organizer of the evil one, a special death for you, you evil roach! You deserve a painful